Hi guys. So this is my presentation over chapter 8. You'll have to bear with me. It is a bit long. There's a lot to cover in this chapter. It is discussing multiple different theories by multiple different people. So we're going to learn about Raymond Cattell, Hans Eysenck, the five-factor theory, Hexaco, and the dark triad. First, we're going to discuss the genetics approach. Hippocrates distinguished four types of people: happy, unhappy, temperamental, apathetic. He believed the causes of the different types was biological rather than experience or learning. The first person we're going to talk about is Raymond Cattell. He was born in England in 1905. His parents had pretty high standards for how their kids behaved, but they also allowed them to do what they wanted in their spare time. Cattell and his brother spent a lot of time outside playing with their friends. In 1914, when he was just 9 years old, in the middle of World War I, a mansion nearby his home was turned into a hospital during the war. And because of this, he saw a lot of wounded soldiers, dying soldiers, dead soldiers. And this made him become more aware of the brevity of life. He felt the need to accomplish more before his death. And a lot of people believe that this is what caused his intense dedication to work. So he enrolled in the University of London when he was just 16. He wanted to study physics and chemistry. He ended up graduating with honors in just 3 years. But he realized that the physical sciences didn't really give him what he needed to deal with society. So he made the decision to study the human mind, which at the time was considered a job for eccentrics. He went on to study with Charles E. Spearman, who was a psychologist statistician. And in 1929, he was awarded his PhD. Now, he had a hard time finding a job because, again, psychology was not a highly regarded field at the time. But in 1927, he started lecturing at Exeter University. It was kind of all he could do at the time in the field of psychology, and this is where he wrote his first book. And in 1932, he opened the Leicester Child Guidance Clinic and was the director for 5 years. He also pursued his own research at this time. So Raymond had some hardships during this time. He developed a lot of digestive disorders because he was overworked and his diet was not the best. His wife left him at this time because of economic hardships, and this kind of forced him to focus on more practical problems rather than theoretical issues. In 1941, he started working with Gordon Allport and William Sheldon at Harvard University for just a little bit. He married a mathematician and settled into the University of Illinois as a research professor when he was 40. He published more than 500 articles and 43 books. He ended up joining the facility of the University of Hawaii when he was in his 70s, and he died in Honolulu at the age of 92 in 1998, a year after he was awarded the Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in Psychological Science from the American Psychological Association. So here we have a picture of Raymond Cattell, just to give you an idea of who he was. And we're going to talk about how he predicted behavior. His goal was to predict how a person would behave in a given situation. And instead of using subjects that were already mentally ill, he wanted to use normal people to study their personality instead of just treating it like other psychologists at the time would. So he used what's called the factor analysis approach. This involves assessing the relationship between each possible pair of measurements taken from a group of subjects. So what this means is if two measures of a psychological test showed correlation with one another, Cattell would conclude that they measured similar aspects of personality. His approach was very scientific. He relied heavily on observations of behavior and masses of data, and he would take two sets of data about a person and combine them to form a single factor. So he had different personality traits that he would kind of categorize these factors under. We have the common traits, unique traits, ability traits, constitutional traits, temperament traits, dynamic traits, surface traits, and environmental mold traits. Cattell believed that they were the mental elements of personality. And to understand someone fully, we need to be able to describe the entire pattern of traits and not just the individual ones. So we have the common traits, which he believed were possessed by everyone to some degree. Some people had a higher level of them than others. We have the unique traits, which are aspects of our personality that only a few others would have. It's not something that everyone would contain. Our ability traits determine how we will be able to work toward a goal. Our dynamic traits are kind of the driving forces behind our behavior. It's what motivates us, what defines our interests and ambitions. Our temperament traits describe the style and emotional tone of our behavior. Surface traits are personality characteristics that kind of line up with each other, but they don't constitute a factor because they're not determined by a single source. They are made up of different elements that are less permanent than other traits. And then we have our constitutional traits, which originate in our biological condition. They are kind of things like how we behave if we've been drinking. And environmental mold traits come from the influences around us, whether social or our physical environment. It's characteristics and behaviors that we have learned. Okay, so I know this table is a very large table. Pause it if you want to read through them. It's also in the book if you want to go through and look at that. These are the 16 traits identified by Cattell, which he uses the personality test called the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire to identify in a person. Cattell argued that psychologists can't understand or create laws about personality without describing the nature of these elements. Here we have our dynamic traits, which again are traits that are concerned with motivation, and we discussed it a little bit a few slides back. Cattell believed that a personality theory that failed to consider these dynamic traits and the impact of them was not complete. He believed that you couldn't understand why a person had a certain trait to their personality without understanding how that trait came about. So Cattell showed a lot of interest in heredity and environment and shaping personality. He believed that there were genetic and environmental influences to the way we behaved. He studied twins who grew up in the same family, twins who grew up apart, siblings who grew up in the same family, and siblings who grew up apart. And what he found was that they had a lot of shared personality traits, even if they hadn't grown up together. He concluded that overall, a third of our personality is genetically based and 2/3 is determined by our social and environmental factors. So there are 6 stages of personality development that Cattell proposed. We have the infancy stage, the childhood stage, the adolescent stage, maturity stage, late maturity, and old age. In infancy, which is birth to age 6, it's kind of the major formative period for personality. This is when a lot of your personality traits are influenced by your environment. Cattell he was not really a follower of Freud, but he did agree with Freud in the fact that the early years of life were crucial in forming personality. This is when a lot of feelings of security or insecurity came about. This is when kids would have development of their ego and superego. It is also when some children would go through traumas that will affect them for a long time. If you've ever heard of a reactive attachment disorder, it usually stems from this stage of life. It's usually when the trauma occurs that causes reactive attachment disorder. And a lot of the therapies to kind of help correct that or to take the person back to that point to kind of reset how their brain reacts to that trauma that they went through. In the childhood stage, which is ages 6 to 14, there's not a lot of psychological problems that come about. This is when kids start to work towards independence from their parents. They start to make friends and find a group that they fit in with and relate to. In the adolescent stage, which is ages 14 to 23, this is when a lot of emotional disorders come about. It's when a lot of delinquency happens, when kids start to get in trouble, they start to push their boundaries to see what they can and can't get away with. A lot of experimentation happens during this time. Kids will kind of figure out what they like, what they don't like. They're trying to figure out who they are, and a lot of experimentation occurs because of this. And actually, 50% of psychological disorders usually develop by the age of 14 and 3/4 by the age of 24, which is right in this stage of life is when all of these changes are happening, all of these things are coming about. In the maturity stage, which is ages 23 to 50, it's a very productive time. Studies show that the average age of people getting married and starting family is 30, and the average age of reaching the peak of your career is the ages between 40 and 50. This is when a lot of people feel fulfilled. The personality becomes less flexible, emotional stability increases, there's not a lot of change in interests and attitudes during this time. In the late maturity phase, this is ages 50 to 65, this is when a lot of midlife crises occur. It's mostly because there's a lot of changes at this time. This is usually when, your kids have grown and gone, you've reached the peak in your career, you've kind of reached the top of that hill, and you're not sure what's on the other side. You start to question what you're doing with your life now. And a lot of people decide to take action against that, and that's what people would call a midlife crisis. You make a big change to try and kind of make yourself feel fulfilled again. In the old age stage, which is ages 65 and up, this is when a lot of adjustments are happening. A lot of feelings of loneliness become more apparent because people are losing their friends, their family, their spouses. Most everyone is passing away because of illness or old age. You're getting up to that point as well. There's a lot of loneliness and insecurity felt at this time. So, questions about human nature. So personality is kind of how we predict what a person will do in a given situation. For behavior to be considered predictable, it has to be lawful and orderly. It's difficult to predict personality without some regularity and consistency. And Cattell's view of human natures doesn't have a lot of spontaneity because that would make predictability more difficult. So in free will versus determinism, Cattell fell more on the side of determinism. He did not propose any ultimate or necessary goals that dominates behavior. He noted the impact of early life events, but he did not believe that childhood forces determine the personality permanently. He accepted the influence of personality of both nature and nurture. So he was right on the fence between the two. And with uniqueness and universality, he took a moderate position. He noted the existence of common traits, which apply to everyone in a culture, and unique traits that describe the individual themselves. In his younger years, he was kind of optimistic about our ability to solve our social problems, but obviously reality did not live up to his expectations. And he came to believe that human nature and society had regressed. Some assessments in Cattell's theory. So he used these objective measurements to assess personality. He used life records, questionnaires, tests, and in life records, it's a technique that involves observers' rating of specific behaviors exhibited by people in a real-life setting, such as a classroom or an office. It's important to note that they involve overt behaviors that can be seen by an observer and occur in a natural setting rather than an artificial situation in a lab. With questionnaires, it's a technique that relies on questionnaires that the person fills out themselves. Obviously, the limitations are that they can deliberately falsify their responses to make themselves seem better in their minds. With personality tests, Cattell would use objectives test in which a person responds without knowing what aspect is being evaluated. It makes it difficult for the subject to know what is being measured, and if you can't guess what the experimenter is trying to find out, then you can't distort your responses to kind of make yourself line up with what you believe that they want you to be. Cattell used tests like I apologize if I say this wrong, the Rorschach, the thematic apperception test, and the word association test, because they are very objective. They are almost resistant to faking. There's not a lot of biases to affect scoring and interpretation. The 16PF test was developed by Cattell. It's one of his most notable tests that he developed. It's usually used with those 16 and older. However, there are versions designed for children and adolescents. It is scored very objectively. It is used to assess personality for research, clinical diagnosis, and even predicting success on the job. He had several variations of it, some to measure specific aspects of personality like depression, anxiety, and others that measured special purposes like marriage counseling. So the ways that he studied personality, he listed 3 ways. The bivariate approach, which is a 2-variable approach that involves manipulating one variable. This determines how it's going to affect the subject's behavior. For Cattell, though, this approach was too restrictive because it only dealt with a limited aspect of the personality. With the clinical approach, he used case studies, dream analysis, free associations. It was not really regarded as verifiable and quantifiable by Cattell. And then Cattell himself chose to use the multivariate approach, which is more sophisticated. It's a statistical procedure of factor analysis using the R technique and the P technique. The R technique involves collecting large amounts of data from a group of people, while the P technique involved collecting large amounts of data from a single person over a period of time. Some critics argued that opportunity exists for subjectivity to affect the outcome of these factor analysis approaches. At several stages in the research process, decisions are required that may be influenced by personal preferences. It doesn't mean that there's any weakness in Cattell's theory, but there is potential for subjective errors in the factor analytic approach. It is this subjectivity that makes Cattell's findings hard to replicate. He remained convinced that one day his work would allow for the prediction of human behavior to the same degree of accuracy with which astronomers predict the movement of planets. He is considered not only the father of personality trait approach, but also one of the 20th century's most influential psychologists. The trait approach to personality and the investigation of genetic influences continue to fascinate researchers today. And now we're going to talk about the next person, Hans Eysenck. There's a little picture of him in case you want to see what he looks like. He was born in Berlin in 1916. He wanted to study physics at the University of London, but he didn't have the right academic background to be accepted. So he was basically told to study psychology, and that's what he decided to do. He immigrated to England in 1934 when there was a rise in essentially Hitler's rise. He received his PhD from the University of London in 1940. He published 79 books, his first being published in 1951. It was a study into the genetics of personality. He also wrote over 1,000 journal articles. He developed several personality devices during his life, and his work helped integrate the scientific study of personality into psychology. He developed several devices such as the Eysenck Personality Inventory, the Eysenck Personality Profiler, the Maudsley Medical Questionnaire, and the Maudsley Personality Inventory. And he actually was the world's most frequently cited psychologist at the time of his death in 1997. But his wife destroyed all of his personal and professional papers after he died. So he spent most of his career at the University of London's Maudsley Hospital and Institute of Psychiatry. He agreed with Cattell that personality is composed of different traits and factors, but he was a critic of the factor analysis. He believed that the potential subjectivity in the technique and the difficulty in replicating Cattell's findings made it not so reliable. But he supplemented the method with personality tests and experimental studies that considered a wide range of variables. His second wife developed many of the questionnaires used in their research, and he actually acknowledged her in their first publishing, which very few scientists had done at the time. The Eysenck Personality Inventory required 12 years of joint research and 20 factor analyses. Now, their personality theory was based on 3 dimensions that they called superfactors. You have the E dimension that stood for extroversion versus introversion. You have the N dimension that stands for neuroticism versus emotional stability. You have the P dimension, which stands for psychoticism versus impulse control. Now, he suggested that formulations of the same dimensions could be found on nearly every personality assessment device ever developed. For example, people who score high on the traits of the E dimension would be classified as extroverts, whereas people who scored low would be classified as introverts. The E dimension includes sociable, lively, active, assertive, sensation-seeking, carefree, dominant, and venturesome. Some traits of the N dimension are anxious, depressed, guilty feelings, low self-esteem, tense, shy, moody. Some traits of the P dimension are aggressive, cold, egocentric, impersonal, antisocial. Eysenck noted that the dimensions of extroversion and neuroticism have been recognized as basic elements of personality since the time of ancient Greek philosophers. Now, traits and dimensions proposed by Eysenck remained pretty stable throughout the lifespan. Our situations may change, but the dimensions remained constant. There were other studies done in England and Scandinavian countries that confirmed the stability of Eysenck's dimensions over time. Eysenck considered intelligence a very important influence on personality. He conducted a lot of research on intelligence, and his research suggested that 80% of our intelligence is inherited, while the other 20% is environmental. Here we're going to learn about extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Now, extroverts are more oriented toward the outside world. They prefer the company of other people. They tend to be more sociable, more adventurous, more dominant. They experience more pleasant emotions and tend to be happier than introverts. They have a lower base level of cortical arousal than introverts, And because of this, they need excitement and they need stimulation. Whereas introverts tend to shy away from excitement and stimulation because their cortical arousal levels are already high. Introverts react more strongly to sensory and stimulation. They tend to have lower pain thresholds than extroverts. With neuroticism, neurotics are characterized as anxious, depressed, moody. They typically have low self-esteem. They're prone to guilty feelings. Eysenck suggested that it's inherited instead of being learned from experience or those around you. There is greater activity in the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is kind of the body's alarm system that responds to stressful or dangerous events by increasing your heart rate, blood flow to the muscles, release of adrenaline. Neurotics react emotionally to events that other people would consider insignificant. There was research done on 16 to 70-year-old Americans that showed increasing satisfaction gained from work and social relationships that was associated with a lower level of neuroticism and a higher level of extroversion. There was a study done in Australia that showed people who scored high in neuroticism was fast-paced and stressful. Neurotics seem to function best in busy situations where they were forced to work harder. A study in England showed people high in neuroticism scored lower in verbal abilities than did people low in neuroticism. And research on people in Sweden found that in middle age, they were much more likely to show cognitive impairments when tested again 25 years later. Now, psychoticism. Now, people who score high in this are antisocial, aggressive, egocentric. They can be cruel, hostile, and insensitive to others' feelings. There's evidence to suggest a very large genetic component for psychoticism. Those who score high had more authoritarian and controlling parents instead of supporting. Those who they tend to score low on emotional well-being and have more problems with alcohol, drug abuse, violent criminal behavior. Men generally tend to score higher than women, which led Eysenck to suggest it may be related to male hormones, potentially. And people who score high on all three of these dimensions are more likely to display criminal behavior. Research conducted in China demonstrated a significant correlation between criminal behavior and high scores on both the psychoticism and neuroticism dimensions. A person high in psychoticism is typically full of hostile and aggressive behaviors. They may become emotionally disturbed or exhibit criminal tendencies, or they can even learn to channel these aggressive traits into something more socially acceptable, like coaching a sports team. Now, traits and dimensions are determined primarily by heredity. Research evidence shows a stronger genetic component for extroversion and neuroticism than for psychoticism. Eysenck did not rule out environmental influences, but he believed they were very limited. His research involved a lot of comparisons between identical and fraternal twins. This showed the identical twins are more alike in their personalities than fraternal twins, even if they were raised apart. He studied adopted children, and This demonstrated their personalities bear a great similarity to the personalities of their biological parents, even with no contact with them. And a lot of cross-cultural research demonstrates that these three dimensions have been found consistent in more than 35 nations. Now, the next people we're going to talk about is Robert McCrae and Paul Costa. I apologize for the quality of the photo. It was really hard to find one of the both of them. Now, Cattell and Eysenk's methods varied in a number of ways, and it doesn't mean that they were weak, but it just reflects the different ways that each theorist chose to measure personality. Recent researchers suggested that Eysenck had too few dimensions, whereas Cattell had too many. Here comes in Robert McCrae and Paul Costa, who both worked at the Gerontology Research Center of the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. They started a big research program in the 1980s that identified big 5 factors. These 5 factors are neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and consciousness. Conscientiousness. That's a hard one to say. So these factors are confirmed through a variety of different assessment techniques. McCrae and Costa developed the NEO personality inventory. There is a shorter version available on the internet. These factors can be relied on as distinguishing aspects of personality. Other researchers developed adjective checklists, which have been proven to be quicker measures of the 5 factors, although it can be distorted because patients answer those questions themselves. The origin and overlap of the factors. So we've talked about the studies of twins a lot. It has also shown that 4 of the 5 factors show a strong hereditary component in neuroticism, extroversion, openness, and conscientiousness. Agreeableness was found to have a stronger environmental component. Openness actually has a lot of correlation with intelligence, and there's a similarity between the extroversion and neuroticism factors of McCrae and Costa and the ones proposed by Eysenck. Now, the cultural and gender differences. The 5 factors are observed in Eastern as well as Western cultures. It's found in more than 50 nations. McCrae and Costa noted that the big 5 factors and their traits appear to represent a common human structure of personality that transcends culture. It's found in more than 50 different nations. The differences have been recognized in their importance from one culture to another. Now, research carried out in 55 countries found that women reported higher levels of neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness than men. The expectations. Now, people see themselves as more neurotic and open than others see them, but they see others higher in conscientiousness than they believe themselves to have. So basically, we see ourselves higher up than others may see us, and we put others higher up than they see themselves. These expectations kind of lead to teachers and parents reinforcing certain behaviors. Do parents and teachers treat extroverted children differently than introverted children? There's a large number of studies dealing with the stability of the 5 factors over time. It's very important to have a stability of these kind of assessments. And the stability has been found in both children and adults. Those high in agreeableness as children were likely to remain so as adults. There was a study in Finland that found a high degree of stability for both men and women on extroversion and eroticism over a 40-year span. And college graduates tested for extroversion when they were students, and again 20 years later, showed that there was a significant correlation between the test scores and those who were extroverted in college, remaining so in midlife. The next people we're kind of going to touch over very quickly is Michael Ashton and Ki-Byung Lee. Ashton works for the psychology department at Brock University, and Lee works for the psychology department at the University of Calgary. They proposed a 6-factor model of personality. The factors are honesty, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. Extroversion and conscientiousness are very similar to the 5-factor model, but the other 4 are different. And they assess these by 2 self-report inventories. Research is still ongoing to determine the behavioral and emotional correlates of this model. Studies show that those who score high in honesty and humility received higher job performance ratings than those who scored low. And those who scored low in honesty and humility were more likely to be convicted of crimes. And now we come to Delroy Polhus and Kevin Williams. Both work at the University of British Columbia. They introduced a 3-factor approach to understand the darker side of personality, the narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And I just realized I spelled that wrong. This is known as the dark triad of personality. Now, narcissism is an inflated sense of one's abilities. They constantly need attention and admiration. Narcissists are extremely selfish. The Dirty Dozen scale is kind of a self-rating test developed as a way to assess the dark triad. So there are certain things you can, statements that are put out that you agree with or don't agree with, such as, I tend to manipulate others to get my way. I have used flattery to get my way. I tend to exploit others toward my own end. I tend to lack remorse. I tend to be unconcerned with the morality of my actions. I tend to be callous or insensitive. I tend to be cynical. I tend to want others to admire me. I want others to pay attention to me. I tend to seek prestige or status. I have used deceit or lied to get my way. I tend to expect special favors from others. How would you rate yourself on these items? Now, going back to before we talked about narcissism a little bit. Now, before we move on to behavior correlates, we have I want to touch on Machiavellianism real quick. It's the need to manipulate others. These kind of people are very cunning and deceitful. Their behavior is atrocious. And then psychopaths take great advantage of other people, often using violence or charm. They're callous and egocentric. They're insensitive. They do not care who they hurt. Now, the correlations of behavior. Those who scored high on all 3 of these traits engaged in more antisocial activities. They got satisfaction from the misfortune of others. They tend to be cold, aggressive. They are usually more prone to criminal activity. And funny enough, the content of their Facebook updates was a valid predictor of their levels of psychopathy and narcissism. Their updates tended to be more emotionally cold and aggressive and self-promoting. And those who scored high on Machiavellianism, and psychopathy showed very little empathy and consideration for others. They had a very high level of aggression and low scores on emotional stability. The dark triad is also associated with exploitative sexual relationships. Psychopathy is usually linked to a high sex drive with strong sexual and sadomasochist themes and fantasies. Now to reflect on these trait approaches, which thank you for bearing with me this long. I know it's a long presentation. There's a lot of information to cover, and I felt like a lot of it was very important. There's a lot of evidence. The evidence is greater for the factors of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. The findings from behavioral genetics may require us to restructure our research efforts in the future if we want to fully account for the development of personality. Inheritance may even account for up to 50% of personality. There's so many different factors that make up our personality, and